So is it really possible in this day and age to take a raw card, get it graded in a PSA 10 and make $1,000 profit? For any of you that watch my other videos, you know I'm primarily a sealed investor. I don't make my money from investing in singles. But in the Scarlet and Violet era, it's getting very, very hard to ignore some of the huge profit margins that can be made taking a raw card and getting it graded in a PSA 10. A couple of caveats here. It's not easy to grade some of these in a PSA 10, and a lot of them are coming back in 9s, which means you either lose money or break even, and it's just not worth it. But the margins on some of these cards are so big that it's worth picking up a few and getting them graded, trying to get that 10. Obviously, when you look at buying raw singles off eBay or anywhere else, you really want to get good photos. You want to make sure the centering's good, the edges are good, there's no damage, the surface is good. The photos can only tell you half of the story, and it's not until you get that card delivered in person that you can really see if it is a good quality 10 potentially. So there's lots of variances to look at, but in today's video there's 12 cards only from the Scarlet and Violet era and only English Pokemon cards that we're going to look at. There's 12 cards here on this list that when graded in a PSA 10 have insane profit margins, and you need to look at these cards, guys. Let's get into it. Now, I mentioned at the start of this video how it might be possible to get a $1,000 profit when taking a raw card and getting it graded in a 10. I was referring to this Magikarp that we all love, we all know from Paldea Evolved, the #1 chase card from Paldea Evolved. Now, the raw version, $147 according to eBay, right? The graded version, PSA 10 grade, you can see here, $1,138. Once you take into consideration grading and postage costs, you're at about $950, $960 profit, right? So where's the $1,000? That's not quite $1,000, right? So where am I going with this? Now, if you had this card, or if you bought this card, let's say you bought this card for $147 raw, right? You got a mint condition card. You looked at the centering, the edges, the surface. It looks like it could get a 10, right? There's a good chance of getting a 10. You buy this card for $147. Now, the PSA 10 price is $11.38, like I said. But the thing is, it might take 2 or 3 or 4 months to get this card back from PSA. And this card is on the uptick. This card price is soaring. By the time you get this card back, the PSA 10 price, I'm quite confident, is going to be more than $11.38. Bang, you got your $1,000 profit if it comes back in a 10. If it comes back in a 9, you're looking at $183 for the 9. You possibly break even after postage and grading costs. I think even the 9s are going to increase in value over the next couple of years, so I don't see it being a loss long term if this comes back in a 9. I think this is a really card, if you can find it, mint condition, great centering, great cornering, great edges. You know the 4 criteria, right, for grading. If you can find a card that looks impeccable at $150 US, I think this is a really good investment. Again, I'm a sealed investor primarily, but it is so hard to ignore the profit margins we're seeing in some of the graded cards from the Scarlet and Violet era. Not all of them, but some of them. And this is a perfect example. This card has almost $1,000 profit. I think that's like 7 or 8 or 9 times. I think it's almost 10 times. Basically, it's almost 10 times your investment return. I'm not sure of the exact percentages. That's why I said the dollars figure is about $1,000 profit, guys. Here's the Tyranitar, guys. I said there's 12 on this list. Let's try and bang through them. This Tyranitar, also from Paldea Evolved. This card, $36, $37 raw. In a PSA 10, $268. You're talking about a $230 profit. Again, once you take off grading and postage costs, if this comes back in a 10, you've got over $200 profit, around $210 profit if it comes back in a 10. Now, there's 494 PSA 10s in circulation, just under 1,400 9s. That tells me it tends to come back in a 9 way more than a 10. So I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying this is a slam dunk. Be very careful if you buy these cards raw that they are in impeccable condition and the photos are accurate if you're not buying it in person. If you can buy singles in person from somewhere, it's a much better way to inspect the card up close and personal. but huge profit margins. $200 odd profit if it comes back in a 10. If it comes back in a 9, you really are losing money in the short term on your investment. The $41 for the 9 wouldn't cover the cost of the card, the purchase price, and the grading and postage costs and so on. But that's the risk. That's why the 10 is so valuable, because it's not as easy to get. Here's the Nine Tails. This is from Obsidian Flames. Now, Obsidian Flames, from a sealed investment perspective, in my opinion, based on my methodology, Obsidian Flames is quite a weak set, though some of the cards in it are quite nice. This Nine Tails is probably my favorite card, or one of my favorite cards from Obsidian Flames. It's a beautiful card so far as Nine Tails goes. $13 to $14 raw, $18 according to TCG Player, $13 on eBay. If you get this in a 10, $142 this sells for in a PSA 10. Again, the raw card's only $13. These are all US prices, guys. Now, there's 1,144 PSA 10s. There's just over 2,000 PSA 9s. That tells me that when people think this is a good card and they send it away for grading, the 9s are coming back more than the 10s. There's about almost twice as many PSA 9s, right? So you're looking at about a 1/3 chance at getting the PSA 10. But the profit margin, what's that, $128 profit margin? Again, postage and grading, maybe it's just over $100 profit. That's a huge profit. If you can pick up 2 or 3 Nine Tails in really mint condition, good cornering, good centering, and get it graded in a 10, you're talking about $100 plus profit margin after all expenses, guys. Again, if it comes back in a 9, that's the risk you guys have to equate. Everything has risk. There's no such thing as a risk-free investment. You know, all progress involves risk. You can't steal second base and leave your foot on first. At some point, you have to take a risk. Make it an educated risk. Do your homework. Here's the Ghastly from Temporal Forces. Not my favorite card. It's not bad. You know, I'm not a diehard Ghastly fan or anything. But look, $148 in a PSA 10. $26 you can pick this card up for raw. There's 1,624 PSA 10s and 1,900, just over 1,900 PSA 9s. That's all. It's not quite 50-50, right? There's more 9s. The 9s are coming back slightly more than the 10s. But it's almost 50-50. It's not a bad shot at getting a 10. Again, if you inspect the card well, it's not a bad shot at getting a 10. It's like a 45% chance or something like that of getting a 10. And the profit margin, again, 148 for a PSA 10. Take away the 26, you're at 120. Postage and grading, you're at $100 clear profit. Clear profit. If this comes back in a 10. Again, if you buy it, it comes back in a 9, you're losing money. For now. Might be worth more in a couple of years in a 9. That's the risk. But $100 profit for this Ghastly if it comes back in a 10. That's insane. There's better ones on this list. You wait till the back end of this list, guys. There's a couple that are crazy margins. Here's the Gengar from Temporal Forces. $14 raw, $84 in a PSA 10. Why did I put this on the list? That margin is not as good as some of the others. That's still a really good margin. You're talking about $70 profit if it comes back in a 10, right? You take away postage and grading, maybe you're at $45, $50, depending on where you get your cards graded and what the costs are for you. You're at, what did I say, 80, 70? You're at about $50 profit margin after all expenses, right? But the good thing with this Gengar from Temporal Forces, there's over 1,500 PSA 10s and 887 PSA 9s. So a lot more 10s are coming back than 9s. So this card is not as hard to grade in a 10. Pardon me. According to those numbers, I can surmise from those numbers that this is not as difficult to grade in a 10 as some of these other cards on this list. And while $50 is not a crazy, huge, awesome profit margin, that's solid. If you pick up 2 of these Gengars for $30 and one comes back in a 9 and one comes back in a 10, you're still ahead. And you can sell the 9 and almost break even. So that's a really good profit margin on the Gengar. It's a cheapie, but a goodie. And great margins. Great margins. Here's the Loudred from Paradox Rift. This is not a hugely sought after card. This is not one I've heard anyone really speak about. I don't even think it's a top 10 chase card off memory from Paradox Rift. But Paradox Rift, while while I don't think Paradox Rift is a strong set from an investment perspective, it's got some awesome cards in that set. If you just love to open packets and have fun, Paradox Rift has got some great illustrations. And this Loudred, $71 in a PSA 10, $9 raw. You can pick up this card for $9 raw, guys. Get it graded in a PSA 10, you're at $71. You're at about $40 profit after all expenses if it comes back in a 10. There are 210 PSA 10s, not a heavily graded card. This is kind of flying under the radar because it's a cheapie. People don't tend to grade cheap cards a lot. 192 PSA 9s, 210 PSA 10s. There's more 10s than 9s coming back slightly. So let's say you got a 50-50 shot of getting a 10. The card's $9 raw. Pick a couple up. One comes back in a 9. Who cares? Leave it aside in your collection. But if you inspect the card well, it comes back in a 10. You got a good profit margin for a really cheap card. Another cheapie, but a goodie from Paradox Rift. Here's the Raichu from Paldea Evolved. Now, we all know this card. We all love this card. It is a bit of a fan favorite. But again, a huge markup in a PSA 10. A bit harder to grade in a 10. There's 502 PSA 10s, almost 1,300 PSA 9s. So a lot harder to grade in a 10. Inspect the card well. If you think it's going to get a 10, maybe buy it, get it graded. $33 raw, $200 almost in a PSA 10. You're talking about $140 or so profit after all expenses if it comes back in a 10. So if you're really good at spotting the 10s, there is some money to be made. Of course, when a card comes back in a 9, it's like, no! Because you either lose money or you're lucky to break even, and it just sucks. The whole process was kind of almost a waste of time. But if you're really good at spotting 10s, this is one of those cards. It's worth buying it, getting it graded. There's huge profit margins in this card, guys. If you take away, $33 off $198, you're at $165. You take away postage and grading, maybe you get $140, $145, $140 clear profit when this comes back in a 10. Great way to make money, guys, if you can pick these up in 10s. This next card is insane. Check this out from Paldea Evolved. Check this out. The Fuecoco, $11 to $12 raw, $15 according to TCG Player, $11.83 on eBay. PSA 10, $179 off an $11 raw card. Guys, that's like 15 times. It's worth 15 times more in a PSA 10. Granted, they're harder to grade in a 10, this one. That's okay. The profit margin's worth the risk, right? 171 PSA 10s, 400 PSA 9s, 165 PSA 8s. Not as many 10s are coming back with this card, guys. I actually have this card. I will get it graded. I do need to look at it to see what the centering's like. I hope it's worth getting graded because the profit margin is nuts on this card. 179 for a PSA 10. You're at, 167 once you take away the raw cost. Maybe $140, $145 profit after all grading and postage costs. $140 profit for an $11 card for a Fuecoco. It's a beautiful card, but I had no idea that the PSA 10s were going for this much. Pick up a couple of Fuecocos, guys. This thing is crazy. The profit margin is insane. I think it's the strongest or the second strongest on this list so far as the margin. You're talking about, what's this? I think that's about 15, 16 times profit on the raw version, something like that. I calculated all these earlier. It's something like that. I might be a bit off, but the margin's huge. Here's the Pikachu from Paldean Fates, the shiny Pikachu. This one, there's 689 PSA 10s, 1240 PSA 9s. Again, you got about a 1/3 or so chance, 35% chance of it coming back in a 10. $27 raw, $161 in a PSA 10. You're at about $110 profit margin after all expenses, after the cost of the card, grading and postage. You're at well over $110 profit margin on this Pikachu from Paldean Fates. Might be worth picking some of these cards up, guys. Some of these on this list, most of these on this list are not that expensive to buy. It's worth the risk if you can inspect them and they look good. Go and get them graded. Hopefully you get some 10s. Here's the Golisopod EX from Paradox Rift. $12.50 raw, $12.50 raw, $90 in a PSA 10. You know, in a PSA 9, again, you're losing money by the time you spend money on grading and postage. You're losing money at $23. There's 230 PSA 10s, 259 PSA 9s, almost a 50-50 chance of getting a PSA 10. And you've got, after expenses, you've got like a $50 or $60 profit margin. Call it $50 clear profit margin. Again, it's a cheapie but a goodie. No one's paying attention to these little cheapies in Paradox Rift, but there's some of these other sets like Paldea Evolved and even Shrouded Fable, which we're going to look at now. This Okidogi, I have mentioned this in a previous video recently. The margin's huge on this. A $20 raw card, $100 in a PSA 10. There's 110 PSA 10s and 166 PSA 9s on the market. If it comes back in a 9, you are absolutely positively losing money. The 9s are worthless. The 9s are cheaper than the raw card. But you know, that's a 500% markup from the raw to the PSA 10 for this Okidogi. Shrouded Fable gets snubbed a lot, but that Okidogi's got a really good profit margin. If you've got this in your collection, if you've pulled this card, check it out. The centering, corners, edges, and surface are good. Go and get it graded. It's worth getting graded. Here's one from Ralts. Now, we saw how insane the margin was on that Fuecoco from Paldea Evolved, but this Ralts from Scarlet and Violet base, which is arguably a very weak set, look at that margin. $18 to $23 raw for this Ralts. In a PSA 10, $271. You're talking about a $250 gross profit margin, $225, $230 after postage and grading costs. Well over $200 profit. If you've got this card, go and get it graded, but first check the cornering, the edges, the centering. If you think you've got a 10 sitting there with this Ralts, this is definitely worth getting graded. I would even say it's worth buying a few of these raw and just sending them all the way to get graded. If they come back in 9s, you're losing a little bit of money by the time you work out your grading costs. $29 in a 9. There's 949s, there's 240 PSA 10s, 359 PSA 8s. This is hard to grade in a 10. Again, if you find a great copy, man, pick it up. The margin on this Ralts and that Fuecoco I showed you a few minutes ago are next level. You just do not see these margins very often in modern sets, and these are not expensive cards to buy raw. Let's be honest, they are not. The Magikarp was expensive, quite expensive, but even that's cheap relative to the PSA 10. There's 12 cards, guys, that if you have them in your collection, or if you're interested in buying them raw in amazing condition, you should absolutely find these cards and get them graded, because if they come back in 10s, there are insane profit margins on these 12 cards from the Scarlet and Violet era. Thanks for watching the Chase Card. I hope this was helpful. See you in the next video. Bye, everyone.